As slow as it was to dig out the rock in the tunnel, at least we had been making progress there. The next few days were spent almost entirely in the garden, working hard for no other purpose than as a cover for what we were actually doing, or should have been doing. I didn't mind the idea of gardening, but the weeds were thick and sometimes thorny, and by the third day it was hard to care about the dirt out here when he I really wanted to be down in the tunnel working. After an entire afternoon of pointless, sweaty labor, I didn't think the weeds looked any better than when we first began. When the heat of the day hit us, personification, Fritz and I decided to sneak inside the building to get back to our real work. As before, he went into the tunnel while I removed dirt with the bucket. But the small basement room was already piling high with dirt, and that bothered me. We had a long way to go before we reached the west. What if we ran out of places to store the dirt? Something needed to be done with it. I briefly toyed with the idea of returning to the weeding. At least the weeds didn't require me to think so much. Then I smiled as the wonderful idea came to me. If it worked, it would solve both of my problems. Rather than dump out the bucket inside the basement, I opened the boarded window and dumped it out there. It made a much smaller pile than I expected, so I refilled the bucket from the dirt already in the basement and dumped it outside too. After 5 or 6 loads of dirt, I climbed outside, then used the small hand rake from the estate to spread the dirt around. It went down smooth and dark and covered up every single weed beneath it. I didn't need to pull weeds. I could cover them up. Sure, our vegetable seeds wouldn't grow very well once they hit that hard ground a few centimeters down, but I didn't care about that. I didn't plan to be here that long. With renewed energy, I began emptying dirt from the basement. The routine was the same, to dump several loads at once and then spread it out. I did it slowly and tried to make it look as if I was pulling weeds rather than covering them. The watchtower was far enough away that unless the guards looked carefully, there wouldn't be any reason to investigate further. Or at least I hoped not. I was always listening for the approaching sounds of one of their vehicles. After a while, Fritz called up to ask what I was doing, and when I invited him to see for himself, he only chuckled and brushed his hand across my head. Trust you to do so much hard work to get out of other hard work, he said, but don't go so fast. If someone is looking for progress, they'll never believe we got all that weeded in a day. He was right. I returned to carrying the dirt back up the ladder, over and over. That was my routine. Climb down to the air raid shelter, scoop the dirt into the bucket, hook it over my arm, climb up the ladder, dump it out, repeat. Again and again and again. Rest a little and then start all over. I lost track days ago how many times I made the climb. I could do this now in my sleep. Who knows? I was so tired, maybe I did. I usually took my rest in the shelter while I watched Fritz's progress. He was nearly 5 meters, like 15 feet, into the tunnel and kept track of how straight it was with the same boards he had nailed together perpendicular to each other. Perpendiculars like this. If one end was always kept straight with the shelter's entrance, the other end should point like an arrow in the direction he should dig. One late afternoon, Fritz said he would lift the buckets for me if I would go and find water to refill his canteen, his water bottle. It required a short walk back to the main part of the city, but I was eager for the change of routine. I stripped off my overalls and stopped by the pond to wash my face and hands. If I was going to convince a restaurant to give me water, I needed to be presentable enough to walk inside. Then I set off toward a nearby sausage shop where my family used to eat. When I was almost to the restaurant, my eye roamed across the street to the building that had been bombed during the war and still hadn't been repaired. Attempts had been made to clear it some years ago. I could tell that because of some rusty old machinery and other pieces of equipment left on the side. There was even a long rope with a pulley attached so that the heavier items could be lifted onto trucks. A pulley! My mind began racing as I pictured that very item in the basement of the Welcome Building. With a pulley, there would be no more climbing up and down. right? They could just use the string to pull it up and down. Fritz could fill the dirt below, and I could pull it up with a rope and then empty it in the basement. We could work twice as fast with half the effort. I needed that pulley. Gerda, what are you doing? I swerved around and saw Anna had come up behind me. Her mother was already seated inside the restaurant where I intended to get water, though I hadn't noticed either of them before now. It shouldn't have surprised me to see them here. This was their neighborhood, after all. But of course, she would be surprised to see me, and looking as dirty as I am, as I'm sure I did. I stepped back and forced a smile to my face. Fritz and I are gardening. Like I told you about earlier, I just came to refill our canteens. Let me get it for you, she said, and then wrinkled up her nose. No offense, but you smell like you're up to your eyeballs in gardening. That was true enough, in a way. I handed her our canteens, and she took them inside while I waited, trying as hard as I could not to look at the pulley on the other side of the street. It was only attached by another thick rope. With a good knife, I could cut it free. But when? Certainly not on a day as busy as this one. The problem was that in this neighborhood, every day was busy. It was only at night, after curfew, when everything went quiet. After a few minutes, Anna emerged with full canteens of water, so cold I could feel it through the metal. I wanted to gulp down an entire one right then. Thank you, I said rather awkwardly. She called out a, "You're welcome," as I walked away, which thoroughly confused me. Were we friends again? Why? Nothing had changed, unless it had changed on her end. Maybe Stasi had decided to leave her family alone, and she felt safe to be friends with me again. I didn't know if I was ready for that. After all, she had treated me horribly over the last couple of months, and I had much bigger things on my mind than anyone's friendship, which included a need to get into her apartment, I reminded myself. For the sake of the tunnel, I would have to make things good between us, and soon. But in the meantime, I had a pulley to steal. Chapter 24. If you live among wolves, you have to act like a wolf. Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet Union premier. Soviet Union is Russia. The premier is like the leader. From 1958 to 1964. I didn't tell Fritz my plan. Not only would he have accused me of every kind of stupidity, but he also would have been right to do it. However, he couldn't feel the aches in my body every night after hauling up those buckets. It wasn't just my arms or shoulders. Every part of me was exhausted and sore. Each morning, I started more tired and ended more drained. I was carrying lighter loads than we first began and fewer of them. If something didn't change by the end of the week, Fritz would be doing all the work while I sat aside, useless as the growing piles of dirt. Police regularly patrolled the streets after curfew, but as young as I was, if they caught me, probably the worst thing to happen would be a ride home in their car with a slapped hand and another page in my file. Probably. Unless I had already stolen the pulley by then, which would be impossible to explain. It would be reported to the Stasi, who would wonder what a 12-year-old girl wanted with such a tool. They would find the tunnel, and we'd have gone too far for me to pretend Fritz had been involved. So it was decided then. I couldn't get caught. It was very early on a rainy Saturday morning when I snuck out of the apartment. My plan was to get to the pulley before anyone else was allowed outside and to be on my way home immediately after curfew was lifted. That way, I only had to sneak around in one direction. I wore my blandest clothes, which really only required a choice between communist gray and communist grayer. They would camouflage me against the walls in the early morning light. I also brought a small burlap sack, like a bag, and our sharpest kitchen knife. Almost as soon as I got onto the street, a Trabant Kubel, meaning the little car, drove by full of police, and I backed into the shadows of our doorway. The officers' rifles reflected from the streetlights, and their shared laughter was coarse and louder than it ought to be for this early hour. Louder than it ever ought to be, actually. I wondered what men like them might find funny. Probably we had a different sense of humor, because nothing about the police force ever made me smile. For several long minutes after they left, I fought against my instinct to go back inside. That would have been the smart thing to do. Then I reminded myself that tunneling beneath the death strip was hardly a smart act, so at least I was being consistent. After they could no longer be heard, I made myself take the first step onto the sidewalk. And after that, I was committed. The streets were quieter than I'd seen them, and it felt as though the entire city had been abandoned. This was probably what my neighborhood would have become if the Berlin Wall hadn't gone up. We would have left, and Herr Kraus too. A family who would live below us also had plans to leave once. I was sure there were others. Eventually, the whole city would have emptied out, except for the most loyal party officials and the Stasi and Grenzers officers. Or what did I know? Maybe they would have left too, given the chance. Russia's new first secretary, Brezhnev, would have rolled through here on a tour from Moscow and found he was the leader of a vast country of empty buildings and overgrown farmland. I balled up my courage and my fists along with it, rounding the safety of the corner while keeping as close to the shadows and cover as possible. Saw nobody, heard nobody, and as far as I could tell, I was completely alone out here. The next part of my walk was the most dangerous. I had to dart across a street that was usually quite busy in the daytime. The rain would help, but it wasn't falling hard enough for a full camouflage, and even at a full sprint, it would take me 2 or 3 seconds to cross the wide street. I stayed hidden at the corner for several minutes, steeling my nerves. Even through the heavy clouds, the sky was already growing lighter. I had to run. If I didn't go now, then curfew would end, and I would be stuck here with no hope of getting that pulley. I refused to haul dirt buckets up that ladder again, not when a much better option was within my reach. That single thought was enough to prompt me into moving. I gave one last look in every direction and then ran. Ran like I never had before. I was blind to everything but the corner in front of me and the protection it would offer. My feet were light upon the street, and I jumped the curb so there would be no chance of tripping. Then I lunged for the cove of the nearest building as if fire was at my heels. I landed in there and almost screamed. A woman was already using that same cove to hide and looked as startled to see me as I was her. Her silky long hair was dark as her sleek outfit, but pulled behind her in a fashion more elegant than I usually saw. She was beautiful, but had clearly tried to play it down by wearing only a bare amount of makeup. I felt clumsy and plain beside her, and would have left right away if I had anywhere better to go. Her face softened as she looked at me. I know you. Aldous Lowe's daughter, right? It bothered me that she knew that, especially since I was certain I did not know her. She only smiled and said, It looks like you are no better at staying out of trouble than he was. But your father was a very inspirational man. He meant a lot to those of us who wanted to see things changed here in the East. She spoke of him like he was dead, the same way my mother often did. Something I always resented, hated. And she hadn't told me anything about herself. Getting no reaction from me, the woman said, It's not safe to be out here this time of night. She reached in her pocket and pulled out 5 Ostmark. Could you use this? Frankly, I was so relieved that she didn't demand a bribe of silence from me, I barely even thought about the fact that I was the one receiving the bribe, meaning this woman was giving her money because this woman did not want Goethe to tell on her. She smiled when I nodded and pressed the money into my hand, and then added, Shall we agree not to have seen each other then? Agreed, I mumbled, and then she ran off the way I had just come, while I darted in the other direction. My mind burned with curiosity for who that woman was and how she knew my father, but there was much stronger urge for me to get to that pulley. The sun was rising fast. I didn't have much time. About 15 minutes later, I reached the neighborhood with the pulley. Since it was the weekend, several of the stores would be closed today, and I had some time before the rest opened. Many of the residents here would have already left for the countryside, drowning their troubles in a bottle of Pilsner. I hoped those who remained were sleeping in late. I breathed a little easier once I was in the lot with the damaged building. There were plenty of places to hide, and based on the scattered garbage I passed, other people had hidden here before me. I had to stack a couple of cinder blocks on their ends to stand high enough to reach the pulley. But after checking the area carefully to be sure I was still alone, I reached up with my knife, sawed off the rope, and let the pulley drop to the ground. I jumped down, hid it in my burlap sack, and crouched behind the rubble in the lot until the first signs of traffic grew around me. So she's hiding until the curfew is lifted, so then she can just walk freely in the street. It was an easy walk home, but as soon as I rounded the last corner, I saw Fritz waiting for me on the street. His face was nearly purple, and his breaths were harsh and shallow. He grabbed my shirt collar and yanked me inside the apartment building and twisted me around. "What were you thinking?" he hissed. My chest tightened as I got ready for the argument that was clearly coming. I had known he'd been angry when he learned I was gone, especially that I went alone, but my reasons were good. If he wanted to fight about this, we would, but I would win. We needed to get something, and I got it. I said, "Nothing is worth what you did. How dare you, Goethe?" I started to retort, but quickly lost any interest in arguing. Now that I really looked at him, it wasn't anger in his eyes. It was fear, more than I'd ever seen in my brother before. I opened the burlap sack just enough for him to see what was inside, and when I did, he nodded, and tears streamed down his cheek. He grabbed me into a hug, his stiff fingers digging into my back to communicate the worries still trapped inside him. He whispered, "That was too stupid to count as bravery. What if we lost you? Never do that again, Goethe. Never do anything like that again." I gave him an apology, but only for making him so afraid. I could never regret what I'd done, because now we had a pulley.